Vladimir Ilyich Lenin, the architect of the Bolshevik Revolution and founder of the world's first socialist state, presented himself as nearly a teetotaler, a man of discipline and revolutionary purity. Unlike the czarist officials he despised, who were notorious for their drunken excesses, Lenin cultivated an image of sobriety that matched his ideological rigor. Yet even Lenin, the man who would reshape the political landscape of the 20th century, had his indulgences. During his first period of emigration from 1900 to 1905, Lenin lived in Munich, that Bavarian city of beer halls and revolutionary ferment. There, far from the czarist secret police, he became a regular patron of the Hofbrau beer house, an establishment whose name would be remembered in the memoirs of those who knew him. His wife, Nadezhda Krupskaya, the loyal companion who shared his exile and his vision, confirmed in her writings that Lenin's fondness for beer extended beyond Munich. In Paris, where Russian revolutionaries gathered in smoky cafes to debate the future, Lenin would sit among workers, order a small jug of dark beer, and spend entire evenings discussing strategy and theory. The beer was not mere refreshment, but a social lubricant, a way to connect with the proletariat he claimed to represent, to appear as one of them rather than as the educated son of a provincial official. But Lenin's relationship with alcohol was not limited to beer. In 1910, the Finnish communist Yrjö Sirola shared a meal with Lenin at a restaurant, and when a carafe of vodka made its way around the table, Sirola hesitated, uncertain whether the revolutionary leader would approve. Lenin's response was telling. "My party does not forbid it," he said, and took his shot. This moment, small and seemingly insignificant, reveals the careful balance Lenin maintained between ideological purity and practical reality. He would not be seen as a drunkard, but neither would he alienate his comrades by adopting the moralistic stance of a temperance crusader. Lenin understood that revolution required solidarity, and solidarity sometimes required sharing a drink. When he seized power in October 1917 and began the brutal work of consolidating Bolshevik control, Lenin would implement policies that restricted alcohol production and sales, seeing vodka as a tool of czarist oppression that kept the masses docile. Yet his own moderate consumption continued, a private contradiction to his public stance, a reminder that even the most ideologically driven leaders are human. The man who succeeded Lenin after a vicious power struggle in the 1920s was a figure of entirely different character. Joseph Stalin, born Ioseb Djugashvili in the Georgian town of Gori in 1878, brought to the Kremlin the drinking culture of his Caucasian homeland. Georgia, with its ancient wine-making traditions stretching back 8,000 years, had produced wines that were celebrated throughout the Russian Empire. Stalin, despite his transformation into a ruthless dictator who would be responsible for the deaths of millions through purges, forced collectivization, and the Gulag system remained loyal to the wines of his youth. His favorites were Kvanchkara and Kinsmaroli, both semi-sweet red wines from Georgia's western regions, wines that embodied the warmth and complexity of the land that had shaped him. In his final years, as his paranoia deepened and his health declined, Stalin developed a taste for Magyari, a young homemade wine saturated with carbon dioxide, which he dismissively called juice for children, perhaps a way to minimize his consumption in his own mind or to others who might question his capacity. But Stalin's drinking was never simply about personal pleasure. It was a weapon, a tool of statecraft, a means of testing and dominating those around him. The dictator's banquets were legendary and terrifying affairs where officials were forced to drink heavily, while Stalin himself often watered down his own glass or poured it into potted plants when no one was watching. He used alcohol to loosen tongues, to observe who could hold their liquor and their secrets, to create an atmosphere of forced camaraderie that masked the ever-present threat of denunciation and death. Air Marshal Alexander Golovanov, one of Stalin's trusted military commanders, witnessed firsthand how Stalin deployed alcohol in his dealings with foreign leaders. During the Tehran Conference in November 1943, where Stalin met with Winston Churchill and Franklin Roosevelt to coordinate Allied strategy against Nazi Germany, the Soviet leader engaged in a drinking contest with the British Prime Minister. Golovanov recalled watching Churchill examine a bottle of Armenian cognac before filling Stalin's glass. Stalin reciprocated, and the toasts began, one after another, the two men matching each other drink for drink as they negotiated the fate of post-war Europe. When the meeting concluded, Churchill left the room supported under the arms by his aides, clearly intoxicated. Stalin, however, walked out with what Golovanov described as a firm, unhurried gait. What followed was even more revealing. Stalin told Golovanov directly, "Do not worry, I will not drink Russia away." But Churchill will be out of his mind tomorrow when he is told what he babbled here. When big state affairs are done, any drink should seem like water to you and you will always be on top. This statement encapsulates Stalin's philosophy of power. Alcohol was not a vice to be indulged, but a tool to be mastered, a means of gaining advantage over adversaries and allies alike. While Churchill, for all his brilliance and courage, allowed himself to be genuinely affected by the cognac, Stalin maintained control, using the appearance of drinking to build rapport while ensuring his mind remained sharp. The next day at the conference, as Churchill nursed a hangover and perhaps worried about what indiscretions he might have committed, Stalin held the advantage, having observed his counterpart's weaknesses while revealing none of his own. This was the Georgian way of power, rooted in the tradition of the supra, the elaborate Georgian feast where toasts are not mere pleasantries but performances of status and wit, where the tamada or toastmaster controls the flow of both wine and conversation. The death of Stalin in March 1953, possibly from a stroke or possibly from something more sinister, opened a new chapter in Soviet leadership. After a brief period of collective leadership and the execution of the hated secret police chief Lavrentiy Beria, Nikita Sergeyevich Khrushchev emerged as first secretary of the Communist Party. Born in 1894 to a working-class family in the village of Kalinovka near the Russian-Ukrainian border, Khrushchev was a man of the people in a way that neither Lenin nor Stalin had been. His tastes reflected his origins. Where Stalin preferred the refined wines of Georgia, Khrushchev favored vodka and cognac, the strong drinks of Russian workers and peasants. But Khrushchev was also a modernizer who wanted to prove that the Soviet Union could match the West in every domain, including the production of fine wines and spirits. Under Khrushchev's leadership, specialists from Moscow Metrostroy, the organization responsible for building the Moscow Metro, were dispatched to Crimea with an unusual assignment. They were to construct underground galleries and cellars for the Koktebel winery, creating optimal conditions for aging wine and cognac. Khrushchev envisioned Soviet wines and cognacs that would equal or surpass the quality of French champagne and cognac, another front in the Cold War competition that defined every aspect of Soviet life in the 1950s and 60s. This was the era of the kitchen debate, when Khrushchev and Vice President Richard Nixon argued about the relative merits of capitalism and communism while standing in a model American kitchen in Moscow. If Soviet citizens could drink cognac as fine as Napoleon, it would be another proof of socialism's superiority. Yet Khrushchev's personal relationship with alcohol was far less controlled than Stalin's had been. In December 1963, as his political position was weakening due to the failures of his agricultural policies and the humiliation of backing down during the Cuban Missile Crisis, Khrushchev invited Finnish President Urho Kekkonen to his hunting residence in Zavidovo, northwest of Moscow. What transpired at that dinner became the stuff of diplomatic legend. Khrushchev ordered Stolichnaya Vodka, one of the Soviet Union's premium brands, to be served not in the traditional small shot glasses, but in champagne flutes, vessels that held several times the normal amount. This was a challenge, a test of endurance disguised as hospitality. The two men drank through the evening, and by the end of the feast, guards had to lead Khrushchev away under his arms, the Soviet leader unable to walk unassisted. Kekkonen, a former athlete with a legendary capacity for alcohol, calmly poured himself another full flute of vodka and drank it with the words, "One for the road." The symbolism was unmistakable. The Finnish president had bested the Soviet leader at his own game, and in the coded language of Cold War diplomacy, this mattered. Less than a year later, in October 1964, Khrushchev would be removed from power in a bloodless coup orchestrated by his colleagues in the Politburo, who cited his erratic behavior and policy failures as justification. The man who replaced Khrushchev was Leonid Ilyich Brezhnev, born in 1906 in the Ukrainian city of Kamenskoye. Brezhnev would lead the Soviet Union for 18 years, from 1964 until his death in 1982, a period that would later be called the Era of Stagnation. Where Khrushchev had been impulsive and reformist, Brezhnev was cautious and conservative, presiding over a system that had lost its revolutionary dynamism and was slowly calcifying. According to legend, Brezhnev loved the saying, "Life is beautiful and wonderful if you wet your throat beforehand," a philosophy that seemed to guide both his personal life and his governance. His favorite drink was Zubrovka, a vodka infused with bison grass, known in Russian as Hierocloe odorata, which gave the spirit a distinctive yellowish-green color and a subtle, sweet aroma. This was not the harsh, burning vodka of peasants, but a refined drink that spoke to Brezhnev's position atop the Soviet hierarchy. Marina Vladi, the French actress who was the last wife of the dissident singer-songwriter Vladimir Vysotsky, met Brezhnev on several occasions and recalled that he shared with her his personal method for drinking strong alcohol: 50 milliliters first, then 100 milliliters, then another 150 milliliters, a gradual escalation totaling 300 milliliters, or roughly 10 ounces. Whether Brezhnev actually stopped at this amount is doubtful. He was a physically strong man who had served as a political commissar during World War II, and by all accounts, his capacity for alcohol was considerable. As the years passed and Brezhnev's health deteriorated, suffering from heart problems, emphysema, and the effects of multiple strokes, rumors circulated that he used his beloved Zubrovka to wash down the numerous pills his doctors prescribed, a dangerous combination that likely accelerated his decline. Brezhnev's drinking took place against the backdrop of increasing Soviet sclerosis. The economy was stagnating, propped up by high oil prices, but fundamentally unable to compete with the technological advances of the West. Dissidents like Andrei Sakharov and Alexander Solzhenitsyn were challenging the regime's legitimacy. The invasion of Afghanistan in December 1979, a decision made by an aging and increasingly infirm Brezhnev and his colleagues, would prove to be the Soviet Union's Vietnam, a quagmire that drained resources and morale. Yet through it all, the rituals of power continued, including the elaborate state dinners, where Brezhnev would raise his glass of Zubrovka and toast to peace and friendship between peoples, even as Soviet tanks rolled through Kabul. The contrast between the rhetoric and the reality had never been starker, and alcohol served as both a lubricant for these contradictions and a symptom of the system's decay. When Brezhnev finally died in November 1982, He was succeeded by Yuri Andropov, the former KGB chief, who lasted only 15 months before his own death. Konstantin Chernenko followed, another sick old man who died after just 13 months in office. By March 1985, when Mikhail Sergeyevich Gorbachev was elected General Secretary of the Communist Party Central Committee, the Soviet Union was in crisis. Born in 1931 in the Stavropol region of southern Russia, Gorbachev was a generation younger than his predecessors and brought a reformist energy that would ultimately prove fatal to the system he was trying to save. One of his first major initiatives was a sweeping anti-alcohol campaign launched in May 1985, just 2 months after taking power. The campaign was driven by genuine concern about the catastrophic levels of alcohol consumption in the Soviet Union, where the average adult drank the equivalent of 15 liters of pure alcohol per year, contributing to declining life expectancy, workplace accidents, and social breakdown. Gorbachev ordered the destruction of vineyards, reduced the production of vodka and wine, restricted the hours when alcohol could be sold, and dramatically increased prices. The campaign was deeply unpopular and economically disastrous, depriving the state budget of billions of rubles in revenue from alcohol sales and driving millions of citizens to produce samogon, illegal home-distilled spirits, often with tragic results. The anti-alcohol campaign became a symbol of the unintended consequences of top-down reform and contributed to Gorbachev's declining popularity. The irony was that Gorbachev himself was not a teetotaler. Leonid Kravchenko, who served as director of USSR state television and radio from 1985 to 1991, recalled that at first, Gorbachev drank very little, maintaining the image of a sober reformer. But as the pressures of office mounted and his reforms of glasnost and perestroika unleashed forces he could not control, Gorbachev began to drink more, favoring wine and cognac. Among cognacs, he preferred yubileyny, an Armenian cognac whose name means anniversary or jubilee, perhaps an unconscious choice for a man who was presiding over what would turn out to be the final chapter of Soviet history. Born in Stavropol, a region with its own wine culture influenced by nearby Georgia and Armenia, Gorbachev understood the tradition of long wine feasts, the supras where men would drink and debate and forge bonds that transcended official positions. As the Soviet Union unraveled between 1985 and 1991, as the Berlin Wall fell, as the Eastern European satellites broke free, as the Baltic republics declared independence, as the August 1991 coup attempt failed and Boris Yeltsin stood on a tank to defend Russian democracy, Gorbachev found himself increasingly isolated. On December the 25th, 1991, he resigned as president of a country that would cease to exist the next day, and the red flag with the hammer and sickle was lowered from the Kremlin for the last time. The Soviet experiment was over, and with it, the particular culture of power that had shaped how its leaders drank. Looking back across these 7 decades, from Lenin's beer in Munich to Gorbachev's cognac in the dying days of the USSR, we can see how alcohol functioned as both symbol and tool in Soviet political culture. For Lenin, moderate drinking was a way to maintain revolutionary credibility while acknowledging human needs. For Stalin, it was a weapon to dominate and deceive, to appear strong while making others weak. For Khrushchev, it was a mark of working-class authenticity and a source of dangerous vulnerability. For Brezhnev, it was comfort, and eventually a crutch, as the system he led stagnated. For Gorbachev, it was a contradiction, the reformer who banned alcohol while privately enjoying it, just as he tried to reform communism while inadvertently destroying it. The drinks these men chose and the ways they consumed them reflected deeper truths about Soviet power. The system demanded public conformity and private compromise, ideological purity and practical corruption, strength and vulnerability. Alcohol was the lubricant that made these contradictions bearable, the social glue that held together a leadership class that lived in constant fear of each other and of the system they controlled. The toasts at Kremlin banquets were rituals of power, performances where every gesture was watched and interpreted, where drinking too much or too little could be a fatal mistake. In this sense, what Soviet leaders drank matters because it reveals how power actually worked in a totalitarian system, not through the formal structures of party congresses and five-year plans, but through personal relationships, psychological dominance, and the careful management of image and reality. The legacy of this culture persists in post-Soviet Russia, where political meetings still feature vodka and toasts, where leaders still use alcohol to test and bond with subordinates and rivals, where the line between celebration and coercion remains blurred, a reminder that the Soviet Union may have fallen, but the habits of power it created have proven remarkably durable.